If you woke up today and saw headlines claiming Saudi Arabia just ended the petrodollar, what you were actually looking at wasn't breaking news, it was the aftermath of a coordinated event. What happened is being framed as a historical contract expiring, a routine geopolitical shift, something for analysts to debate calmly on Bloomberg and CNBC. But that framing is the distraction. What unfolded is far more serious. The quiet dismantling of the monetary structure that underpins the global reserve currency system. And here's the problem. The explanation being pushed in the mainstream isn't wrong by accident, it's incomplete by design. They want the conversation trapped around a symbolic 50-year agreement because that keeps attention away from the real mechanism that just changed. This wasn't about a document ending, it was about infrastructure being replaced. And when the infrastructure changes, power shifts whether anyone announces it or not. If you want to understand what actually happened, not the headline version, but the structural reality beneath it, stay with me. Because once you see how this system really works, you won't look at the dollar, energy markets, or global power the same way again. Never existed. So you do not see the actual weapon that was used. The weapon is not a piece of paper, the weapon is a software program, and it was deployed in June 2024 at exactly 11:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, when the Saudi Central Bank officially joined Project Enbridge as a full participant. That is the smoking gun. That is the moment the petrodollar system received its fatal wound. And I'm going to walk you through the autopsy step by step because the data does not lie. The central banks lie, the media lies, but the blockchain does not lie. Before we go any further, I need you to understand something. The algorithm is actively suppressing this video right now. YouTube does not want this information on the public feed because it contradicts the official narrative that everything is fine and the dollar is stable. You need to hit the like button immediately. Not because I'm asking nicely, not because you enjoyed the intro, but because that is the only way to force this data into the recommended feed where people who are not subscribed can see it. The like button is not a compliment, it is a signal booster. It is a weapon against censorship. So if you believe the petrodollar system is collapsing in real time and the mainstream media is lying about it, you need to boost the signal right now. That is your job. I will provide the data, you provide the engagement. Let's go. Now let's talk about what everyone got wrong. For the past 2 weeks, social media has been flooded with posts claiming that a 50-year petrodollar agreement between the United States and Saudi Arabia expired on June 9th, 2024. The posts claim that Nixon signed a secret deal in 1974 that forced Saudi Arabia to only accept US dollars for oil, and that deal just expired. Here's the problem. That contract does not exist. I have gone through the diplomatic archives. I have read the Joint Commission agreements from 1974. There is no 50-year expiration clause. What happened in 1974 was a series of agreements related to economic cooperation and military support. Saudi Arabia agreed to recycle oil profits into U.S. Treasury bonds. That was the deal. But there was no contract that said, quote, "We will only accept dollars for 50 years and then we are free." That is a myth, that is a distraction. And the reason I am telling you this is not to defend the establishment. The reason I am telling you this is because the real threat is 10 times worse than a contract expiration. The real threat is technological. The real threat is that Saudi Arabia does not need to wait for a contract to expire because they have built a parallel payment system that makes the dollar optional in real time. That system is called Enbridge, and it went live in June 2024. Let me explain exactly what Enbridge is because this is the part that Bloomberg will not tell you. Project Enbridge is a multi-entral bank digital currency platform. It was developed by the Bank for International Settlements, which is the central bank of central banks, in collaboration with the central banks of China, Thailand, Hong Kong, and the United Arab Emirates. The project started in 2021. It ran pilot tests for 3 years, and in June 2024, it moved to the minimum viable product stage, which means it is live, it is operational, it is processing real transactions. And on June 5th, 2024, 4 days before the fake petrodollar expiration date that everyone was talking about, the Saudi Central Bank, also known as SAMA, officially joined Enbridge as a full participant. Not as an observer, not as a pilot tester, as a full participant. That means Saudi Arabia now has the technical infrastructure to sell oil to China and receive payment instantly in digital yuan without touching the US dollar, without touching the SWIFT system, without asking for permission from the Federal Reserve or the US Treasury. That is the smoking gun. That is the moment the monopoly ended. Now let me explain the mechanics of how this works because this is critical. Under the old petrodollar system, if China wanted to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, the transaction had to flow through the dollar. China would convert yuan into dollars. They would send those dollars through the SWIFT messaging system to a correspondent bank in the United States. That bank would verify the transaction. Then the dollars would be wired to Saudi Arabia. The entire process took days. It required dollar liquidity. It required U.S. banking infrastructure. And it gave the United States the ability to monitor and control every transaction. That is why the dollar is the global reserve currency. Not because it is backed by gold, not because the U.S. economy is the strongest, but because the energy trade, which is the largest commodity market in the world, was denominated in dollars. That created structural demand for dollars. Every country needed dollar reserves to buy energy. That demand allowed the Federal Reserve to print trillions of dollars without causing immediate hyperinflation because those dollars were absorbed by global trade. That is the exorbitant privilege. That is the system that is now dying. Here is how Enbridge changes everything. Under the Enbridge system, China and Saudi Arabia no longer need dollars. The transaction happens on a distributed ledger. The Saudi central bank has a node. The Chinese central bank has a node. When China wants to buy oil, they initiate a payment in digital yuan on the Enbridge platform. The payment is validated by the network in real time. The digital yuan is converted into digital real or kept as yuan, depending on the settlement agreement, and the oil is delivered. The entire transaction takes seconds. There is no SWIFT message. There is no correspondent bank. There is no dollar exposure. The United States is completely cut out of the transaction. And here's the terrifying part. This is not theoretical. This is not a pilot program anymore. This is operational. The BIS announced in June 2024 that Enbridge had processed its first live cross-border payments. The Saudi central bank confirmed its participation. The infrastructure is live. The rails are built. The only question now is velocity. How fast will the energy trade migrate from the dollar system to the Enbridge system? And that is where the mathematics get apocalyptic. Let me show you the numbers because this is the part that should keep you awake at night. The global energy market is approximately $7 trillion per year. That includes crude oil, natural gas, refined products, and liquefied natural gas. $7 trillion. Now, not all of that trade is between China and Saudi Arabia, but let's be conservative. Let's say that 20% of global energy trade migrates to Enbridge over the next 5 years. That is $1.4 trillion per year. That no longer requires dollar settlements. Now, here's the question. Where do those dollars go? Because they do not disappear. If China is no longer converting yuan into dollars to buy oil, that means China is no longer buying dollars. That means there is less demand for dollars. That means the dollar price should fall. But it gets worse because the dollars that are currently circulating in the global energy trade, the dollars that are sitting in reserve accounts at central banks and sovereign wealth funds, those dollars are now excess. They are no longer needed for trade. So what happens to them? They get sold, they get converted back into local currencies, they get spent on goods and services. And when trillions of dollars that were previously locked up in the trade system suddenly flood back into circulation, that is called a velocity shock. That is when the money supply that was dormant becomes active. And that is when you get inflation, not 3% inflation, not 5% inflation, double-digit inflation, because the money supply did not change, but the velocity changed. The dollars are moving faster. They are chasing the same amount of goods and prices explode. Let me give you a historical example so you understand how this works. In the 1972 seconds after Nixon closed the gold window in 1971, the U.S. made a deal with Saudi Arabia to recycle petrodollars into U.S. treasuries. That deal created artificial demand for dollars in treasuries. It kept interest rates lower than they should have been. It allowed the U.S. to run deficits without immediate consequences. But when that system cracks, when the recycling mechanism breaks, you get the inflation of the late 1970 seconds. You get Paul Volcker raising interest rates to 20% to defend the currency. You get a decade of economic stagnation, and that was just a crack in the system. That was not a full collapse. What we are looking at now is not a crack. It is a parallel system that makes the dollar optional. That is exponentially worse, because in the 1.97 seconds, there was no alternative. Countries were angry about Nixon closing the gold window, but they had no choice but to keep using dollars because there was no other settlement system. Now there is. It is called Enbridge, and it is operational. Now I need to show you the confession because this is the part that proves the Saudis are not bluffing. In January 2023, Saudi Finance Minister Mohammed Al-Jadaan gave an interview at the World Economic Forum in Davos. He was asked directly about the petrodollar system, and here is what he said. Quote, "There are no issues with discussing how we settle our trade arrangements, whether it is in the US dollar, whether it is the euro, whether it is the Saudi rial," end quote. Now that might sound like diplomatic language. That might sound like he is just being polite and keeping options. open. But let me translate that for you. What he just said is that the dollar monopoly is over because for 50 years that question was not even on the table. For 50 years the answer was always the dollar. Period. No discussion. The fact that a Saudi finance minister is now saying publicly that they are open to settling oil trades in other currencies is the equivalent of a central bank governor saying, "We are considering cutting interest rates." It is a signal. It is a policy shift, and it is irreversible. But the confession does not stop there. In December 2022, Saudi Arabia and China signed a currency swap agreement worth 50 billion yuan. That is approximately $6.9 billion US. Now, the mainstream media reported this as a small technical agreement to facilitate trade, but that is not what a currency swap is. A currency swap is plumbing. It is infrastructure. It is the foundation for large-scale trade settlement in local currencies. Here's how it works. Under the swap agreement, the Saudi central bank can exchange reals for yuan directly with the People's Bank of China without going through the dollar. That means if a Chinese company wants to buy oil from Saudi Arabia and pay in yuan, the Saudis can accept yuan and immediately swap it for reals if they want, or they can hold the yuan or they can use the yuan to buy Chinese goods. The point is that the dollar is no longer required. The swap line is the bridge. It is the financial infrastructure that makes non-dollar settlements possible. And 50 billion yuan is not a small pilot program. That is enough liquidity to settle billions of dollars worth of oil transactions. The plumbing is built, the pipes are connected. The only question is when they turn on the valve. Now, I need you to stop and think about what this means for the Federal Reserve, because this is the part that no one is talking about. The Federal Reserve's power is based on the dollar's role as the global reserve currency. That role is based on the fact that energy, the most important commodity in the world, is priced in dollars. If energy is no longer priced in dollars, if the largest oil exporter in the world is now settling trades in yuan and reals, then the structural demand for dollars collapses. And when the structural demand collapses, the Federal Reserve loses its ability to print money without consequences, because up until now the Fed could print trillions of dollars and export the inflation to the rest of the world. Other countries needed dollars for trade, so they absorbed the new supply that kept domestic inflation under control. But if other countries no longer need dollars for trade, then the new supply stays in the United States. And that is when you get the Weimar scenario. That is when you get the velocity shock I described earlier. That is when the money supply that was sitting offshore comes flooding back into the domestic economy and prices go parabolic. Let me give you another historical example to show you how fast this can happen. In 1944, the US and Britain created the Bretton Woods system. Under that system, the dollar was backed by gold and other currencies were pegged to the dollar. That system gave the dollar its reserve currency status. It lasted 27 years. In 1971, Nixon closed the gold window because the US was printing more dollars than it had gold to back them. That was a unilateral decision, and the US broke the rules of the system. But here is the key point. After Nixon closed the gold window, the dollar did not immediately collapse. It took almost a decade for the inflation to show up. It took until 1979 and 1980 for the crisis to hit. Why? Because the petrodollar system was created in 1974 to replace the gold backing. The US made a deal with Saudi Arabia. In exchange for military protection and weapon sales, Saudi Arabia would price oil in dollars and recycle the proceeds into US treasuries. That created a new source of dollar demand. It gave the dollar a commodity backing. It ensured the collapse for another 40 years. But now that system is ending and there is no replacement. There is no new deal that will create structural dollar demand. The Saudis have the technology to bypass the dollar. They have the currency swap with China. They have Enbridge. The infrastructure is operational, and the confession from the finance minister is on the record. This is not a theory. This is policy. Now I need to bring this back to the present because the timeline is accelerating. In June 2024, the same month that Saudi Arabia joined Enbridge, the BIS announced that the project had reached the minimum viable product stage. That means the technology is ready for commercial use. The BIS also announced that Enbridge had successfully completed a pilot transaction involving real commercial payments between banks in China, Thailand, Hong Kong, and the UAE. Real payments, real banks, real money. This is not a sandbox anymore. This is production. And the BIS, which remember is the central bank of central banks, the institution that sets the rules for the global financial system, is actively promoting this technology. They are not trying to stop it. They are not regulating it out of existence. They are building it. They are testing it. They are scaling it. That should tell you everything you need to know about where the global monetary system is headed. The BIS has decided that the future is multi-currency. The future is digital. The future is not dollar denominated. and they are building the infrastructure to make that future a reality. Now let me show you what this looks like on a flowchart because I need you to visualize the mechanism. Under the old system, the flow was linear. China converts yuan to dollars. Dollars flow through SWIFT. Dollars arrive in Saudi Arabia. Saudis use dollars to buy US treasuries or US goods. That circular flow created dollar demand at every step. It was a closed loop. The dollars always came back to the United States. Under the M-Bridge system, the flow is parallel. China pays in digital yuan. The payment is settled on the M-Bridge ledger. Saudi Arabia receives digital yuan or converts to digital real. The dollars are not involved. The SWIFT system is not involved. The US banking system is not involved. The loop is broken. And when the loop is broken, the dollars that were circulating in that loop become excess. They become hot potatoes. No one needs them. No one wants them. And they flood back into the US economy. I need you to go to the comments right now and tell me what you are seeing in your local market because the data I am showing you is macro. It is central bank policy. It is blockchain transactions. But I need field intelligence. I need you to tell me, are you seeing inflation in your grocery bill? Are you seeing shortages? Are you seeing price increases that do not make sense based on the official CPI data? Because if the dollar is losing its reserve status, if the petrodollar system is collapsing in real time, the first place you will see it is in the velocity of money. You will see it in prices moving faster than the money supply suggests they should. You will see it in imported goods becoming more expensive because the dollar is worth less overseas. You will see it in energy prices spiking even when production is stable. So go to the comments, tell me what you are seeing, give me the street price, give me the premium. Be my eyes on the ground because the Bureau of Labor Statistics is lying and the Federal Reserve is lying, and the only way we get the truth is if we crowdsource the data. Let's go. Now let me connect this to the repo market because this is where the systemic risk lives. The repo market is the plumbing of the financial system. It is where banks and institutions borrow cash overnight using treasuries as collateral. The size of the US repo market is approximately $4 trillion per day. $4 trillion. That is the amount of short-term funding that is being rolled over every single night to keep the system liquid. Now here's the problem. A huge portion of that repo activity is driven by foreign banks and foreign institutions that need dollar liquidity to settle international trades. If the international trade system is moving away from the dollar, if energy transactions are being settled in yuan and reals instead of dollars, then the demand for overnight dollar liquidity decreases. That means less activity in the repo market. That means less collateral demand for US treasuries, and that means treasury prices fall and yields spike. We are already seeing this. In September 2023, the 10-year Treasury yield hit 5% for the first time since 2007. The mainstream explanation was that the Fed was hiking rates to fight inflation, but that does not explain why yields kept rising even after the Fed paused hikes in July 2023. The real explanation is that foreign demand for treasuries is collapsing because foreign central banks do not need as many dollar reserves. They are diversifying, they are buying gold, they are building currency swaps, they are joining M-Bridge, and the loss of that bid is showing up in the treasury market. Let me show you the numbers on foreign treasury holdings because this is the smoking gun that confirms the trend. According to the U.S. Treasury's tick data, foreign holdings of U.S. treasuries peaked in 2021 at approximately $7.7 trillion. As of September 2024, foreign holdings have fallen to approximately $7.2 trillion. That is a decline of $500 billion in 3 years. Now, that might not sound like a lot compared to the total treasury market, which is $33 trillion, but here's the problem. The trend is accelerating. In 2023 alone, foreign holdings fell by $200 billion, and the biggest sellers are the countries that matter most for the petrodollar system. China has reduced its treasury holdings from over $1 trillion in 2021 to approximately $770 billion in 2024. That is a decline of over 23%. Saudi Arabia does not report its treasury holdings directly, but estimates based on custody data suggest they have also been reducing their positions. This is not random. This is not noise. This is a coordinated policy shift by the largest holders of petrodollars. They are moving away from treasuries because they are moving away from dollars. Now let's talk about what happens next because this is the part that should terrify you. If the petrodollar system is dying, if foreign demand for treasuries is collapsing, then the Federal Reserve has two choices. Choice one, let treasury yield spike, let the market clear, let interest rates go to wherever they need to go to attract buyers. The problem with choice one is that the US government is running a $2 trillion deficit. The interest expense on the national debt is already over $1 trillion per year at current rates. If yields spike to 7 or 8%, the interest expense could double. That would consume the entire federal budget. That would force austerity or default. That is not politically viable. So the Fed will not choose choice one, they will choose choice two, print money and buy the treasuries themselves. That is quantitative easing, that is monetizing the debt, that is the Weimar playbook, and that is when the inflation really starts. Because when the Fed is the buyer of last resort, when the Fed is the only entity willing to absorb trillions of dollars of new treasury issuance, the market knows the game is over, the market knows the currency is being debased, and that is when you get the repricing event. That is when gold goes to $5,000 per ounce. That is when silver goes to $100 per ounce. That is when Bitcoin goes to $500,000. Not because those assets are becoming more valuable, but because the dollar is becoming worthless. Let me walk you through the timeline of how this plays out, because I want you to understand the sequence. Stage one is denial. That is where we are now. The mainstream media is telling you the petrodollar is fine. They are telling you the 50-year contract story is fake news. They are telling you inflation is transitory and the Fed has everything under control. Stage one lasts until the data becomes undeniable. Stage two is panic. That is when treasury yields spike. That is when the repo market freezes. That is when foreign central banks openly announce they are reducing dollar reserves. Stage two lasts until the Fed intervenes. Stage three is intervention. That is when the Fed announces a new round of QE. That is when they start buying treasuries again. That is when they expand the balance sheet. Stage three creates a temporary calm in the markets. Yields stabilize, stocks rally, everyone thinks the crisis is over. But stage three is a trap because the new money that the Fed is printing has to go somewhere. And if the global trade system is not absorbing it, if foreign central banks are not buying treasuries, then the money stays in the domestic economy. Stage four is the reckoning. That is when the inflation shows up in the CPI. That is when gas prices double. That is when food prices double. That is when the middle class realizes their savings are being destroyed. And stage four is irreversible. Because once inflation expectations become unanchored, once people realize the currency is being debased, they act accordingly. They spend money as fast as they get it, they buy hard assets, they hoard goods, and that accelerates the velocity that creates the feedback loop. That is the hyperinflation spiral. Now I need to show you the China angle because this is the geopolitical masterpiece that no one is talking about. China has been preparing for this moment for over a decade. In 2013, Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative. The mainstream media described it as an infrastructure program. They said China was building roads and ports in developing countries to expand trade. That was true. But it was not the whole story. The Belt and Road Initiative was also a currency strategy. Every port that China built, every railway that China financed created a bilateral trade relationship that could be settled in yuan. China was building the physical infrastructure for a non-dollar trade network. And it worked. Today, China is the largest trading partner for over 120 countries. You need something that everyone trusts, and that asset is gold. The central banks are not buying gold because they think the price is going up. They are buying gold because they are preparing for a world where the dollar is no longer the dominant reserve currency. They are buying gold because gold is the bridge between the old system and the new system. And when the transition accelerates, when the petrodollar system finally breaks, gold is going to repreg higher, much higher, because the central banks are going to need a lot more of it to back the new currencies. Let me show you what this means for your portfolio, because this is the part that matters to you personally. If the petrodollar system is collapsing, if the dollar is losing its reserve status, then you need to own assets that are not denominated in dollars. That means physical gold, that means physical silver, that means Bitcoin, that means real estate, that means productive businesses. You do not want to be holding cash. You do not want to be holding bonds because those are claims on dollars. And if the dollar is being debased, if the velocity is accelerating, then those claims are losing value in real time. The wealth transfer that is happening right now is from paper assets to hard assets. It is from financial claims to physical goods. And if you are not positioned for that transfer, if you are sitting in a 60-40 portfolio of stocks and bonds, you are going to get destroyed. Not because the stock market crashes, but because the purchasing power of your returns evaporates. You could see a 20% gain in your stock portfolio and still lose money in real terms if inflation is running at 25%. That is the hidden tax. That is the theft that happens through currency debasement. And the only way to protect yourself is to own things that cannot be printed. Now, before I wrap this up, I need to address the elephant in the room. Some of you are thinking, if this is true, why is the dollar still strong? Why is the dollar index at 105? Why are treasury yields only at 4.5% and not 10%? Here is the answer: lag time. The petrodollar system is not going to collapse overnight. It is going to collapse over years. The infrastructure is being built. The currency swaps are being signed. The mBridge platform is being scaled. But the volume of trade that is moving away from dollars is still small compared to the total. It might be 5% of global energy trade today, but it will be 10% next year and 20% the year after. And at some point, probably around 25 to 30%, you hit the tipping point. That is when the market wakes up. That is when the dollar index collapses. That is when yields spike. That is when the panic starts. And by the time the mainstream media is reporting on it, by the time Bloomberg and CNBC are running special reports on the death of the petrodollar, it will be too late. The smart money will have already moved. The central banks will have already repositioned. The only people left holding the bag will be the retail investors who believe the denial. Do not be that person. Let me give you the final piece of evidence, and then I will tell you what to do. In October 2024, the BIS released a report on Project mBridge. The report stated that the platform had successfully processed over $22 million worth of real commercial transactions during the pilot phase. Now, $22 million is nothing compared to the trillions of dollars that flow through SWIFT every day, but that is not the point. The point is that the technology works. The point is that the transactions were successful. The point is that the infrastructure is operational, and the BIS specifically stated in the report that the next phase is to scale the platform to onboard more central banks to increase transaction volume to make mBridge the global standard for cross-border payments. That is a direct quote from the BIS. They are not hiding this. They are not being subtle. They are openly stating that the future of global payments is not dollar-based. It is multi-currency. It is digital. It is decentralized, and it is happening right now. Here's what you need to do. First, you need to understand that the system is changing. The petrodollar monopoly is over. The dollar will still be important. It will still be a reserve currency, but it will not be the only reserve currency. And that means the structural demand for dollars is going to fall. Second, you need to reposition your assets. Get out of long duration bonds. Get out of cash. Move into hard assets. Buy gold, buy silver, buy Bitcoin if you understand the technology, buy real estate if you can afford it, own things that cannot be printed. Third, you need to stay informed. The mainstream media is not going to tell you when the crisis hits. They are going to deny it until the last possible moment. You need independent sources. You need to be monitoring the data yourself. You need to be watching treasury yields. You need to be watching foreign exchange reserves. You need to be watching central bank gold purchases. And fourth, you need to be subscribed to this channel with notifications on, because I do not know how long this platform allows me to keep putting out this information. I do not know how long before they decide that this content is too dangerous, that it is causing panic, that it needs to be suppressed. The algorithm is already throttling this video. The view count is already being manipulated. So if you want to get the alert before the banks close the doors, if you want to get the warning before the currency crisis hits, you need to subscribe right now, not because you like my personality, not because you agree with everything I say, but because this is the only place where you are going to get the unfiltered data.